talk. Today we are going to explore the role of the state in the transformation towards a more sustainable and equitable socioeconomic system. We have outlined a somewhat provocative question to frame the conversation tonight. Degrowth, with, without, or against the state. And of course, as the concept of degrowth is dialectical and pluralistic, we are not expecting to find one answer, but many multi-layered answers. My name is Katja, and I'm joining from Tampere, Finland. It's a beautiful evening here. The summer has really arrived, and I'm eager to get this session started. I'm co-moderating this talk with Oksana, who's helping to arrange the audience questions off screen. We also have other off-screen support, so thank you very much for your help tonight, Gabi and Lorenzo. Now, it's my great pleasure to welcome our three remarkable panelists. Pat Kane is a writer, musician, consultant, and activist. I'm glad to have you here, Pat. From where are you joining us, and how are you today?
I am in London at the moment, and I'm feeling resilient.
Excellent. We also have here with us Ruth Kinna. Ruth is a political theorist and historian of ideas at Loughborough University and a member of the Anarchism Research Group. Ruth, how are you today, and from where are you joining?
I'm speaking from Loughborough in the East Midlands, where it's raining, and I'm very well, thank you. It's been a long day, but I'm looking forward to this.
Excellent. And we also have here with us Ekaterina Chertkovskaya. Katja is a researcher based at Lund University, working on degrowth and critical organization studies, with particular interest in alternative organizing, plastics, and work. How are you, Katja, and from where are you calling tonight?
Hello, everyone. I am good. I am in Malmö, in the south of Sweden, and I look forward to the conversation today.
Very good. Me too. So today's webinar will last approximately 90 minutes, and after the live streaming, it will also be available on YouTube channel. Our speakers have provided further references, which you can check out in the notes below here. And I would like to encourage you to join the discussion through the live chat on Twitter. On Twitter, hashtags #NoBackToNormal and degrowth talks will help us to pick up the thread. But we have here the live stream in YouTube, a chat where you can post questions starting now. And Oksana will pick the questions, and I will then ask those from our speakers. But before the question answer part, which will come, we have asked our speakers to give short introductions to the topic of tonight. The role of state in transformation has already come up in earlier Back to Normal degrowth talks. However, in tonight's conversation, we will dive deeper. The degrowths attempt to transform the established social order and its structures of power, authority, hierarchy, and social norms bring the question of the state often in the center of conversation. We will start with a general introduction on the role of the state from the degrowth perspective, and then move to cover the anarchist perspective against the state. Anarchists believe the state of being both detrimental and unnecessary. And we will end with a few examples of working with or without the state. We have also asked our speakers to define the state in the introductory part to help the further conversation. I hope you are as excited as I am. So without further ado, let the talk begin. Our first speaker is Ekaterina Chertkovskaya. Katja is a researcher based at Lund University, working on degrowth and critical organization studies, with particular interest in alternative organizing, plastics, and work. She co-edited Towards a Political Economy of Degrowth in 2019, co-organized the 6th International Degrowth Conference in Malmö, and is part of the editorial collective of Ephemeral Journal. The floor is yours, Katja.
Thanks a lot for the introduction, and thanks a lot for inviting me to be part of this exciting discussion. So the plan during my introductory intervention is to make three points. So one is to introduce degrowth briefly and to set kind of the scene for making a connection to the state. So then the second one will be on bringing up how degrowth has been discussed, how the state has been discussed so far in the degrowth literature and movement. And then the third point will connect to the so far missing anarchist perspective on the state in the degrowth discussion, and open up for further discussion and for Ruth to look into it more deeper. So starting with degrowth, it can be defined as this umbrella term that critiques the centrality of economic growth and economy in today's economies and societies, and embraces alternatives that are simultaneously ecologically sustainable and socially just. So this entanglement of ecological sustainability and social justice is key for degrowth. Then it means that in general, biophysical throughput, that is the energy and material flows, should decrease globally so that sustainability is achieved, let's say, whilst ensuring well-being for all. So equitable distribution of resources. So the idea of degrowth is that it is possible to live well within the environmental and ethical limits, and it is a call for sustainability combined with justice and solidarity. So if we think of the kinds of words that discuss a degrowth as an idea, then this would be, for example, care, conviviality, democratic decision-making, and solidarity, and things like this. So it gives you kind of the idea of what degrowth is about. And then when we talk about economies, usually we talk about the open relocalization of economies, but connected via global networks of solidarity. And in terms of forms of organizing within such an economy, usually we would discuss, for example, cooperatives, we would discuss commons, and including digital commons. We would also discuss agroecology and these kinds of phenomena, which are usually organized from in a bottom-up way and from the grassroots. So this is very key for degrowth, the idea that transformation should come from the bottom-up and grassroots levels. But then the problem that we have been encountering is that, okay, the alternatives are very much there. There are many wherever we are, we can see them being part of our societies. But they kind of exist on the margins of today's pro-growth capitalist economies, and hence it is quite hard for them to survive. So then the question becomes, okay, how these ways of alternative degrowth organizing can be supported, and hence degrowth as a movement and academic discussion doesn't shy away from the discussion of institutions and policies, and the idea is that change should happen in a bottom-up way, but at different levels: local, municipal, national, supranational, and so on. So hence, also as part of the discussion of how to make alternatives flourish and how to create a different kind of society, a society which is an anti-capitalist or post-capitalist one, and which is also beyond growth and doesn't have growth as a central objective, then the discussion of policies becomes important. So hence, this kind of has resulted in thinking what it means for degrowth if we talk about bottom-up transformation, but at the same time we discuss the kinds of policies, say maximum and basic income, shorter working week, and others. But these policies are often within the realm of state decision-making, and hence this brings me to the discussion of the state. So far in the English language discussion of degrowth, there is not so much written. There is more, say, in French, but in English there are two key interventions that I would like to bring up. So far the interventions in the degrowth discussion, they come more from the Marxist side. So one is by Max Koch and the other is by Giacomo D'Alisa. So Max Koch argues that state can have a constructive role in socio-ecological transformation, and he draws on the work of Poulantzas, Bourdieu, and to some extent Gramsci to make this claim. So the idea is that, of course, today states are problematic and growth-oriented, repressive, but also there is this kind of right and left hand of the state. He says, referring to Bourdieu, with the right being responsible for the more punitive side of the state and for the austerity and things like this. But then also there is the other hand of the state that is responsible for welfare and other important issues. So, and then if we think of a post-growth state, the state could have a totally different function, which would bring together eco-social policies and well-being within the biophysical limits. So according to the arguments that Max is making, the state is the kind of body that can overview, that can steer governance of public, private, and common spaces. It can also overview, say, that the ecological limits are being met. So, and it can also have particular kind of discussions or set particular limits on inequality and the kind of inequality that is accepted in society. And his point around the state is that it should be more connected to the local and the global levels rather than the kind of nation state and national levels as it is the case today. So, and then the idea is that this kind of state can come only through bottom-up pressure, and it is not there yet, but there is a possibility, theoretical possibility of the state to do things differently. So, but then this question of how actually to make state different is still open. So then the other contribution of Giacomo D'Alisa engages with the work of Antonio Gramsci and the notion of integral states that Gramsci articulated, and it complements nicely the work of Marx. So the idea is that integral state consists of this political society and the civil society, and there is like he is against the dichotomy between the two. So the idea is that the two have some sort of dialectical relationship. So, and then again, the idea is that actions and practices from the bottom up are necessary for reordering common senses, a very Gramscian term, about the state's role and functioning. And then Giacomo, in his work, he gives the example of maximum income, one of the policies that is discussed in degrowth, which is kind of totally unthinkable when we think of the nation state and this kind of states today. But then if the civil society, which is part of this integral state, is thought of, and then if change is introduced in a bottom-up way in particular spaces which are part of the state, such as the university, exactly the example that Giacomo gives, then it can actually create new common senses around, say, maximum income that can then create the pressure on the state to introduce the policies of maximum income. So, and then again, the question kind of how comes in, because there is this idea of dialectical relationship between the civil society, which can include university, but it can also include cooperatives or social movements and others. So, but there is this assumption of a dialectical relationship, but it is not clear how it would come about. And we have some examples of social movements victories when the state, for example, was pressed to back off of the policies that it was implementing. In Sweden, we had one in October last year, when the fossil gas terminal was stopped because of the pressure from the social movement, so from the kind of direct action and from the Fridays for Future movement. But at the same time, sometimes the voices of the movements are heard by the state or kind of supranational institutions, but then they are taken into the policies in a very abstract way. So for example, the European Green Deal, which is now put forward by the European Commission, it very explicitly refers to the protest of young climate activists. And then it says that, okay, we're now putting forward this agenda because we have listened to your concerns. And even the language of just transition, very movement-based language, is used in their vocabulary. But it is, of course, totally different from the radical transformation that the climate movement is calling for and that the degrowth movement is calling for. So, and then this how question, I think, is something that actually brings me to anarchism, and which I think that anarchism can help us to address. So, of course, anarchism is a very rich theoretical area which can help to illuminate different phenomena that we discuss in degrowth. And for me, it has helped to engage with the questions of work and the kinds of policies that we are thinking through in degrowth discussions. So then there are many points of connection between anarchism and degrowth, and many anarchist sympathies, I would say, within the degrowth movement, even if it is a movement with a multiplicity of theoretical ideas. So, and then anarchists have been fierce critics of the state, but have at the same time, there are experiences of how anarchists have engaged with the state. For example, some of them have been supporting the Scotland independence campaign. Or, for example, there are situations where the Occupy protests from the anarchist organizing have become part of municipal and party politics. So there are interesting experiences to think about and learn from. But what I think is very important in connection to this how question is anarchism as a theory of alternative organizing. So, and I think that in times like now, we need to organize and we also need to be able to do it fast when some unexpected crisis, new crisis hit us. And then anarchism, I think, can help to understand how to do it in a non-hierarchical and equitable way. So I'm thinking, of course, of the work of Marek Bukchin and his ideas of communalism and confederation that kind of complements, or confederalism that complements it. And the idea is that this local bottom-up organizing then connects into confederations without losing the kind of identity or without losing the local situatedness and connectedness. So, and maybe this is the way to think of organizing within movements like the degrowth movement, but also across different movements out there, so that we can act together in unity, but without creating the kinds of hierarchies that can turn out to be bitter and not productive. So I think that, yeah, anarchism can be very important in thinking how to organize without losing this local control and the key aspects of the movements. And I would very much like to discuss it further today, and also listen to Ruth's engagement with this topic. So yeah, I will leave it here for now.
Thanks, Katja. That was an excellent introduction, and I think a good basis for our talk. Our next speaker is without a doubt one of the well-known theorists in the realm of the anarchist studies, and she's highlighting its importance in the transition. It's my great pleasure to introduce Ruth Kinna. Ruth is a political theorist and a historian of ideas at Loughborough University and a member of the Anarchism Research Group. She has recently been working on a project to constitutionalize anarchy. Although much of her work is historical, she is interested in applications of anarchist ideas, particularly mutual aid. She has previously discussed anarchist perspectives on degrowth with Miriam and Alicia Smedberg. We are delighted to have you here tonight, Ruth. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you for everyone for listening, for participating. So, to pick up on the state, I thought what I'd do is try and address this question of with, without, or against the state, first by saying something about anarchist approaches to the state in general terms, and then saying something about direct action, because I think that's quite often misunderstood. So I've got a couple of sort of principal sort of themes, if you like, about the state, which I'll explain. And then I'm going to say something about the modern state, which sets up a kind of a problem, if you like, for anarchists in terms of engagement. And then I'm going to, when I come to direct action, I'll say why I think anarchists can negotiate that problem. So the first theme is the idea that the state is a colonizing force. So although European states have a special relationship to colonization in terms of the non-European world, colonization can also be understood as a sort of general process of absorption. So a process through which social institutions, norms, practices, and rules are structured or repackaged, controlled, and regulated. And this process involves the establishment of jurisdictions. It crucially involves the establishment of single points of authority, so the idea of sovereignty and territorial control. And it's legitimized in various ways, but importantly through a variety of theoretical devices, notably things like the social contract, ideas of protection or security, conceptions of humans' inherent evil or asociability. And for anarchists, these are all fictions. And we believe them are peril, and anarchists describe them as political theologies. So what happens in the process of state formation is that the state itself becomes kind of fetishized, and we accept the idea that we need something in order to organize our affairs for us. So the other theme, I think, that comes very strongly through anarchist writings is the idea that the constitution of the state marks the institutionalization of prevailing relationships of domination. So the state is not the evil against society. Actually, what happens through absorption is that the state tends to cement existing forms of domination and make them static and protect them. So some of these exist within existing social frameworks. So they could be religious, they could be economic, they could be domestic. But some of them are introduced specifically by the process of colonization, of state colonization, notably the domination of economic elites. So one of the points of the state is to protect the interests of those who have who can reap economic advantage. Now, the point of this, I guess, is the anarchist view is that the state is not just the mere servant of the ruling class. So the state, one of the roles of the state, one of the key functions of the state is to introduce a sort of legal guarantee to property. And it does so in ways that structure economic inequalities. So everyone's given the right to property, but only some people actually can realize that right. And once that right is enforced through law, it means that we're all, our relationships are necessarily structured by the inequalities that we inherit over time. The anarchists argue that states can't be detached from the forms of domination that they entrench and legitimize. So the anarchist model differs from the classic Marxist notion of having a base and superstructure. And the reason is that the anarchists, or the principle that the anarchists support, is the idea that you can't just reformat the base and expect the superstructure to change. You can reformat the base, but what you're left with is still complex systems of domination. And unless you attack those systems of domination, then you're locked in the same kind of iron cage, if you like. So anarchists, when they talk about the state, I mean, they distinguish between modern states and pre-modern states. So anarchists recognize that states exist before the modern European state. They tend to associate the rise of the modern European state with the European Middle Ages. So the state emerges sometime between the 15th and or 12th and 15th centuries, and then it becomes the model for all organisation across Europe, and then it gets exported. But they think that the state, or they recognise that the state has a longer kind of heritage, and they think also of the state as being an idea as much as anything else. And they, to that extent, its origins are often traced to Roman law, the imposition of law, the idea that we have to have this centralised code, if you like, to organise our affairs. So states are associated, I suppose, with notions of inflexibility. That's the point. What do anarchists say about modern states? Well, the story here focuses on the monopolisation of physical force. So anarchists tend to anticipate Weber. They also talk about the centralisation of social functions and the extension and regulation of systems of extraction, or what we would call taxation. And taxation is fundamental to the operation of the state, because without taxation you can't support the state's bureaucratic functioning, and you can't provide services. And modern states, classically or typically European modern states, provide services, extensive services, so education, health, welfare, transport, all of these things. And the fact that we have these services tends to trick us, I guess, into thinking that states are good, and that, you know, we consent, if you like, to the domination because we get some kind of payback. But the anarchist, I mean, certainly one of the things that was argued very strongly in the post-war period was that the emergence of the welfare state is actually better understood as the warfare state, because taxation is not only used to militarize states, which it is, but the whole process of taxation is designed to support systems of production that are basically unsustainable. That's the trap we're in, if you like. So what does this mean for degrowth? Well, the anarchist argument is not that democratic institutions are incapable of delivering change. What they tend to argue is that government machinery can only operate within the constraints of domination. So unless the state maintains the structural advantages that it's set up to defend, there can be, or that is the boundary within which all governments operate. So you can get differences, and sometimes important differences, between party political regimes or government regimes, but all of those party political organisations have to work within these very tight constraints, and those constraints are based on prevailing systems of domination, and particularly systems of economic domination, which imply resource extraction. Okay, so the second thing I wanted to say was about direct action, and how this sort of helps anarchists think about, you know, how to escape these kinds of problems, this kind of intractable problem. So I think anarchism is sometimes understood or misunderstood to mean a complete disengagement from political institutions or from institutional politics. And I think that actually the position is a bit more nuanced than that. So anarchists reject political action and have a long history of rejecting political action. And they do so in the sense that this means that we're as citizens, we have to commit only to acting within the constitutions, and or we have an obligation to respect institutions of representative democracy. So the typical anarchist argument is that there is no reason to be bound by laws that are unjust. And there's every reason to defend a principle of individual judgment. I mean, that's the old term. I mean, anarchists will sometimes use the autonomy instead to describe the same idea. But it is up to each one of us as individuals to decide on rightness. And we do that as individuals and in our groups. So on representation in particular, they argue that party political systems necessarily rely on distinctions between leaders and led, which are divisive, and they're also disempowering because they encourage reliance on representatives in ways which undermine our individual judgments and which make politics something external to us. So instead of encouraging us to decide on what we think is right or moral or unjust, Actually, we just sort of delegate decision making out to somebody else and say, you get on with it. And then when things go wrong, we say that's your fault. And the choice we have then is to put somebody else in charge, but actually we still don't take responsibility for the situations we're in. So that's one problem with it. The other problem of constitutional representative party politics is that anarchists argue that it's socially alienating, because all government is fundamentally there to protect the institutions of the state. So if we think that somebody is doing something that's wrong or harmful to us, we're not encouraged to make any kind of direct approach to them, to try and find ways of resolving conflicts directly, to try and negotiate our differences, to try and find consensus. We're not encouraged to do that. We're encouraged to report them, and we're encouraged to get somebody else to use the law to stop them annoying us. So this makes us potential enemies of everybody else, and effectively lobbyists for state power in order to pursue our own ends. And that's necessarily divisive. It builds distrust, and it doesn't build any kind of cohesive action. So does the commitment to direct action mean that anarchists can never engage with mainstream politics? Well, I think the answer to that is no. There are plenty of anarchists who understand that direction, or who think that direct action involves rights. The essential difference with a non-anarchist position is that anarchists don't acknowledge that it's the state that legitimately determines who has rights or what the limits of our rights are. So the anarchist argument, and that's not just an anarchist argument, but it's one that anarchists also adopt, we only have the rights we have because previous generations asserted them and forced their views into the law. So anarchists say, okay, we don't want to force our views into law because that's the route to inflexibility, but we do want to assert our rights, and we can do that as individuals, and we can do that collectively through organisation. There's an important difference, I guess, with the anarchists, is the anarchists, when they talk about rights, they're not talking about asking permission, because they don't recognise the legitimacy of the state. They're making an assertion of power as people who are responsible decision makers and who need to cooperate and find consensus through this assertion of right. So to end on a kind of I hope not too controversial an example, but I will end on an example. So in the UK at least, and I think beyond the UK, Extinction Rebellion recently demanded that the government declare a climate emergency. Now, in my view, that's not an anarchist move, and there's no reason why Extinction Rebellion should make an anarchist move. But I think there's something, there's the way of thinking about this in an anarchistic way, and that would be to just declare the emergency, talk to each other directly about that emergency, and start to organise in order to address it, and not wait for our representatives to do something within a constraint. So to return to the question, do we act with, without, or against the state? My argument is that anarchists are utopians, but they're also realists. Most of us live in states. We have to acknowledge their existence. But in doing so, I think we also have to understand that most of what we want to do can only be achieved by acting against states.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruth. That was remarkably interesting. Next, Pat Kane will highlight some examples of more practical work towards transformation done with or without the state. Pat is a writer, musician, consultant, and activist. He wrote The Play Ethic in 2004 and now speaks and consults globally on creativity, innovation, and the power of play. Pat has also co-founded a national newspaper, Sunday Herald, as well as various civic and political platforms, Commonweal, Yes Scotland, and recently the Alternative UK. Since 2012, Pat has been curating Future Fest for the Innovation Foundation Nesta. He is still recording and performing with his brother Greg Kane in Hue and Cry. I look forward to hearing more about all that, Pat. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Katya. Thank you very much, Ekaterina and Ruth. I'll confess that I'm not an expert in degrowth. I'm a kind of general purpose general purpose progressive intellectual, but I am involved in a few things which really bring some concrete initiatives which bring all of these issues to a focal point. So it may be useful in my 15 minutes just to sort of describe the dilemmas involved in each one. I mean, for example, I mean, to begin with the sort of definition of the state, this is quite a pertinent point, speaking as a Scot, because an aspiration to being a state is something that's a big part of mainstream politics in Scotland. But you know, the concept of self-determination and autonomy isn't just for the state level; it's also very much a part of the movement, as it is for many, you know, civic nationalist movements. So the idea that small I independence and big I independence are an equal factor. I mean, in that sense, Scotland will be 100 years late in terms of coming to that particular equation about nationalism and civics. But here we are, you know, in the world of the Anthropocene, in the world of post-IPCC report, and now the biosphere disruption of COVID, and we have to figure out what polities are the most effective ones and what political processes are the most effective ones to respond to this in order to give people livable lives, maybe even protect them from dangers or protect themselves from dangers. So one thing I'm involved in is a think tank that was launched in the early years of the independence campaign 2012 called Commonweal, which is an old Scots word for commonwealth. And they've just brought out a report called Resilience Economics, which I think they're hoping to sort of brand and corral as an area of interest. And resilience economics is, in a sense, trying to kind of gather together all these questions about how we live within planetary boundaries or live within an ambition to reduce material throughput, but that we don't present this as a kind of a hair shirt exercise. There are qualities of life, there are qualities of well-being that can be maybe transformed from what they are at the moment, consumerist, to something else. Never quite precisely defined, but certainly well-being kind of covers it. The level of detail that this resilience economics report goes into, it's interesting listening to both of you talk about where anarchism comes into the picture, because certainly, you know, if you want to create a nation that's materially self-reliant, that disengages from global supply chains, and gets to work, as it were, on a sort of sustainable, steady state economy and society, you know, you are enjoined in this report to think about this at a Scottish level and to seek more powers at the Scottish national level in order to create banks that are patient with capital, in order to increase borrowing so you can invest in green infrastructure and so forth and so on. And that's an interesting consequence of about 40, 50 years of constitutional activism in Scotland, which led from the grassroots through to a parliament, through to increasing powers, and through to its current sort of legislative difference with the rest of the UK. But that's constitutionalism, right? That's the classic constitutional culture where people come together and invoke the people and then invoke a legal order that is related to the people in some way. And so there's a way in which you can, which a green lefty like me, for example, can look at Scottish nationalist independence politics and say, there is the polity that I should be in charge of in order to enact the regulations that enable everybody at all levels of society, whether it be small businesses or whether it be communities or whether it be education or whatever, or housing or whatever, there's the level of effective polity that will make that change happen. And at the moment in the Scottish Parliament, it's a joint government between the Green Party, the Scottish Green Party, and the Scottish National Party. So electorally, it's a sort of a dream ticket. But the constant argument is there enough jurisdictional power, as Ruth would say, in this polity for it to, you know, enact its policies? So that's a target for green lefties. That's a parliamentary target. I also work with something called the Alternative UK, and the Alternative UK was inspired by Alternative Et, not the German alternative, the Danish Alternative Et, which was a kind of a green liberal party that flourished in Denmark for about 4 or 5 years. It's a wee bit in abeyance now, but it was a very interesting exercise in trying to sort of wipe the slate clean and imagine how a progressive party would appeal to people. And part of its appeal was that the process of politics itself has to be dwelt on. The lack of participation, the lack of friendliness, the alienation of it. So it was very much Uffe Elbeck, who founded it, describes himself as a social anarchist. So it was his version of what a party would be like for the 21st century, driven by a kind of social anarchist, people-centered perspective. But we took that into the UK and tried to start that up in the UK in 2016, 3 years ago, because of Brexit, and particularly because of the murder of Joe Cox MP 3 days before the Brexit vote. So it was a terrible moment all round, but a profound moment nevertheless, because the key phrase that was fashioned by the political experts at the heart of Brexit was take. Originally it was take control, and then it was shifted to take back control. So the whole idea, playing on nudge thinking, whereby people fear to lose things more than they desire to gain them. But nevertheless, the whole idea of taking control of your existence against a European elite, against no smart, cosmopolitan, expert-driven establishments. In the alternative UK, we thought that's a profound call. Let's see if we can dwell with that call, and let's see if we can do it in the context of 2-3% of the available electorate being members of a political party and 96-97% not. So what are the 97-96% thinking about? What do they think of themselves civically? How can we begin to talk to them? And so this is where I veer towards some of Ruth's perspectives, which is that if there's such a disillusionment with politics as usual, if there's such a disconnection and a delegitimizing attitude towards the political classes, then when does the phrase don't ask for forgiveness, don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness kick in? When do localities begin to assert themselves as sovereignties, as polities, as networks that believe that different priorities should pertain within those networks or those boundaries? Or you could be a bioregion or whatever it is, but there's a discussion, or a municipality or a city or even a town council or a parish council, whatever. But what is the point at which a group of people realize that acting in concert, using powerful tools with achievable goals, may prefigure, may make concrete the better world that they want to bring about? And what's interesting in the context of, say, quite a lot of technology at the moment, and this is not just information technology, but energy technology. One of the things we want to explore with the alternative is whether there's a way in which currency systems or energy systems or certification, authentication systems like blockchain and ledger technology, for example, can be assembled around a community that wants to try out, wants to prefigure the future, a future way of living. And what kind of stroppiness, that's a very, very British word, but what kind of bolshiness or stroppiness or confidence is required for that to happen? So what is happening at the moment in, say, places like Preston, which are inspired by Cleveland, and it's called the Preston model or the Cleveland model, is the whole idea of community wealth building, where you look at anchor institutions and say, stop procuring from the multinationals, procure locally. Let's circulate wealth in the local economy. Well, we are wondering whether the next stage of that in the alternative is whether you actually bring a kind of ad hoc infrastructure, highly technical and highly integrated and highly effective, but running in parallel, as it were, with the existing economic, communicational, and maybe even energy systems, and maybe even residence systems. Of the humble squat may become something else if you're just facing an intransigent national government that won't let your locality redefine or redeploy its assets. So what's interesting about that is it's the narrative that fuels that, the cultural narrative that fuels that. And it doesn't feel to us in the alternative UK that it's like the classic old political vocabularies, certainly not antagonistic, maybe agonistic in the definition of Chantal Mouffe, and agonistic in the most enjoyable way. I mean, in terms of building up a kind of local eco-confidence, is a musical or a carnival or a food celebration or some kind of conviviality, as effective a mobilizer of people in terms of loving their locality and wanting to strike out for a different form of life in that. Is that as effective as the classic Gramscian effective political parties, hegemonic narratives, etc., etc.? So, and then the other, just to complicate things further, so as an independent supporter, I'm interested in, the command of a regulatory directive state to push us along the road of Green New Deal. As an English-based localist who's looking at the collapse of political legitimacy, I'm interested in social anarchist, techno-anarchist assertions of local power. But it's interesting. The third thing that I'm not involved in, but I'm certainly associated with, is a thing called the Wellbeing Alliance, which is a really interesting phenomenon of not just small nations, but also regions and cities coming together to share practice about how they practice a well-being economics. And the key person in that is someone called Catherine Trebek, who we profiled on the Alternative UK just a week ago. And in terms of degrowth or post-growth as a mobilizing metaphor or narrative, she's in contact with Kate Rayworth, who talks about donut economics, as you may well know. But Catherine Trebek talks about the economics of arrival. What would it mean to feel as if you had arrived materially, resource-wise, institution-wise, in terms of the complexity of your society? What would it mean to realize that you had arrived rather than needed to travel any further? So it's a kind of restate of the John Stuart Mill steady state concept. But that's how that, it's interesting who that mobilizes, not yet the great nation states, but sometimes the states, the regions within those states, the frustrated states within those states, Catalonia, Scotland, and also cities as well, who are sort of feeling that they are nascent, effective policies, Goldilocks size policies, big enough to be able to have infrastructures, small enough to be able to be identified with and to sort of connect and narrate with their citizens. So that's really not to be coherent at all. It's to be quite an interesting mess, to be honest. But I am, and then my final point would be, and I've got 1 minute left or 30 seconds left, is that degrowth and post-growth, I think are both tools that I would want to use, but for different audiences. I think a sense of being post a particular model, the exhaustion of this model and the need for a new one is quite attractive. Degrowth I worry about because I think that it almost demotivates people in a kind of very intuitive way about what they think is their life is about. Is it about a burgeoning and enriching and deepening? I can be got around. But I'm very interested in this debate, and I'm very illuminated by both your contributions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Pat. That was very, very good, concrete. I think we now have an excellent basis to start the discussion. Before asking you questions, I would like to allow all of our speakers to comment on each other's input briefly. Who would like to start?
Ruth, can I ask you about social anarchism, the Murray Bookchin version? Because it's sort of the anarchism that people feel they can use. It has structures, and it has a strong dialogue with the left tradition. where does it sit within the anarchist tradition? Because obviously it's implicitly ecological as well, in terms of the control over economy, the sort of people's control over the economy.
So I mean, I think Murray Bookchin is still a profound influence on post-68 and social justice movements, activists and anarchists. I mean, that he's a controversial figure, so he alienated quite a lot of or some people in the American movements, I guess. But I mean, in terms of the influence of democratic confederalism, so his idea of reorganizing democratically. So I mean, he's huge, an influence in terms of seeing the potential of something that anarchists had written off, a concept of democracy, which anarchists had kind of written off in the 19th century because they associated it with the suffrage movements and all the rest of it. So, yeah. But this notion that you have to have, if you want meaningful economic change, you have to have meaningful democratic change too. And so a lot of what you were saying, I think, resonates with the kind of the idea of social anarchism, in the sense that, you know, what you're trying to do in thinking about local reorganization is to bring back decision making to groups, to small groups of people. Now, they don't have to be necessarily local; they could be actually diverse, you know, geographically diversely located, but small groups of people who effectively have interest, if you like, in particular decisions, and you try and use that as a basis to then think about not scaling up, which is what you do in the state, but networking across. And I think that basic principle of organization is something that he was so important in pushing. And he, you know, he explicitly makes anarchism ecological. So although I think people like Bookchin were tapping into ideas that were implicit in the late 19th century anarchists, he makes it explicitly a green agenda. And that has fundamentally changed the way that anarchists think.
Thank you. Very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe, Katja, would you like to comment some of the introductory talks that you were listening today and what that brings up in you?
Thank you. Yeah, I have lots of questions floating in my head, so I'm trying to figure out how to focus. So maybe I would like to ask Pat to tell a bit more about the alternative and how you're organized, and if it is a platform that is to become a party, or how it is, because alternative, say in Denmark, they are of course a party, but the way I understood it, it is different for your organization. So then, yeah, I wonder how it works and what are the kind of discussions within the organization in terms of the way for you to organize.
Sure.
And sure. And then also to Ruth, I have a question about, I would like to hear more about this idea of constitutionalizing anarchy. And I think you have in the recent article on this, you have a point about the scaling up versus networking or mimicking, as you call it there. So this is something that I would also like to hear more about, because it seems to me that it can be a way to kind of connect broadly and to act for change.
Okay, I'll briefly answer, Ekaterina. It's a particularly brutal system, as you may know, the electoral system in the UK. I mean, the last shreds of proportionality were lost when we left Europe. So everything's past the post at every single level. So the prospect of an alternative party is probably not likely. But the prospect of a wide range of self-defined small I independents contending at the local government level, where participation is spectacularly low, and there's probably about 20-30%. So there's probably 20-30% of votes to bring in to an electoral process if those contending for those seats are doing something completely different and engaging with citizens in an entirely different way. The great template for us at the moment is something called flat pack democracy, which was started in the village of Frome in Somerset, and which is a bunch of independents who were committed to a very, very egalitarian, participative way of working. And that has cascaded a whole range of experiments about health and about food distribution and about housing. They interestingly have created a handbook out of their method and practice. So again, one of the distinctions, you know, I guess that's an old tactic, right? Communist Manifesto, the platform as a series of statements, you know, as much as a digital platform. Certainly what we're trying to do with the Alternative UK is to use the disseminatory and pervasive power of social media to get material to people and to then pull them in on the basis of what Goethe would call it elective affinities, right? You pull people in because they are deeply attracted by the way you've crafted your message. And then it's a slow growth of people who, when they come through the door of the alternative, are, as it were, I guess they're kind of screened to be active and imaginative and committed in a certain way. So then that's the question of what does that become? Does that start to try to scale itself up to a party? Do you onboard people in the classic social media sense, or are you almost halfway between a party and a talent academy? Are you basically trying to encourage positive deviance to build up their strength and their confidence in each other, which we do through a kind of Lumio board. Lumio is a kind of post-Occupy software. And then go out and initiate projects. And those projects then make their waves, send out their media ripples, generate more projects, they report back. So it's a kind of a media ecological environment that we think we're being political in. And we're interested to see what happens when people are semiotically and mimetically and communicationally engaged. What is their political action then, if they're engaged in that very, very post-21st century kind of way? Hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Thank you, Pat. Very good. I think that's a good description.
Should I just
yes,
answer
please,
the constitutionalizing? So the idea of constitutionalizing really came from two sources. One was partly to sort of contest this idea that anarchism is just about the abolition of the state, because that's so easily defined by anarchists' opponents. So, you know, anarchy then becomes the state, the condition of chaos, because you just have people or societies constructed as if the state was necessary, and then you take the state away. So theoretically, anarchy makes no sense. So part of what we wanted to do was to say, well, what did anarchists mean when they talked about the state's abolition? And the answer we came up with was that actually anarchists are not only critics of Marx, but they were really important critics of Republicans. And they part company with the Republicans when republicanism constitutionalizes itself. And the argument of the Republican Constitution is that, you know, we can come up with an ideal political arrangement that will fix the problem of domination. So we'll just get rid of the monarchs, we'll get rid of arbitrary rule, and we'll have these perfected institutions that will enable people to live in freedom, equality, and fraternity. And the anarchists say, you know, as soon as you try and fix that relationship, you're just going to be cementing forms of domination that you can't see. And you're going to, not only are you going to fix them, you're going to airbrush them out. You're going to remove them from the debate because you've already said that your arrangements are non-dominating. So you don't even have a measure anymore to test where the domination lies. So that was one of the things we wanted to do. We wanted to say, well, if that's one of the starting points for the anarchists, you know, so how did they respond to that? And the other thing that we wanted to talk about was, I mean, partly comes from the influence of people like Bookchip. So while I think that the re-injection of democracy into anarchist discourses is really important. I think there's been a danger because of movement activism or a risk, if you like, that anarchism gets associated almost exclusively with consensus decision making as a practice. So although I think that's important, I don't think that exhausts what anarchist organising is about. So what we tried to do in the work on, or what we're trying to do in the work on constitutionalising, is to think about, well, what does a flexible constitution look like in terms of its practices and its cultures? What's the difference between a liberal or a republican constitution and an anarchist constitution? And where does democracy sit in it? And the answer that we have to that is that the fundamental difference between an anarchist constitution and a non-anarchist one is that there is no final fixed point of authority. So there's no point at which you can say, this is the rule because X. There always has to be debate. There always has to be some other way of negotiating the rule, because you have pluralism and because you have agonism. If you take that seriously, as soon as you say that there's a fixed point of authority, you're using force to resolve the problem. You're not allowing people to resolve it themselves. So the way that we set up the constitution is to think of it in very traditional terms, if you like. So anarchists are rule makers. They have declarative principles or benchmarks. They have institutions, which can be both physical or in terms of norms, and they have decision-making processes. But all of these things work in different ways according to the rules, if you like, the constitutional rules that the group sets up. They have to be negotiable all the time. So if you like, the idea of vigilance, Republican vigilance, becomes essential to what the anarchist does. But that can be quite exhausting. And the reason that the Constitution then helps you is because you want to avoid people getting burnt out by having to always have to work out, what the right way of acting is. There is a framework within which people can develop their political organizations, but they are just frameworks, and they have to be fluid, and they have to be flexible, and they have to be negotiable. And our argument is that breeds a different kind of culture, which is anarchistic. So I mean, as far as I can see, actually anarchist and anarchistic organizations already work like this. So if you look at organizations like Radical Roots or the IWW, this is how they work. They're federated bodies, and they tend to work in these very fluid ways. Whatever people tell you about, well, we have the Constitution, they don't normally refer to the Constitution in the way that a Republican would.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a couple of questions too?
Yes, please.
So one was to Pat, which was really just a sort of an observation as much as anything else. But I also have a question about Commonweal. And the observation was, I think a lot of what you were saying about practical action resonates with what anarchists call mutual aid.
Yes.
So I think there are huge overlaps there and really productive ones. But the question I had about Commonweal, because I think Commonweal, as I understand it, is that is also a federal organisation, a horizontal organisation. So I wondered how far you think that Commonweal is itself potentially prefigurative in terms of Scottish politics.
Sure.
And then the question I had for Katia was about the sort of the kind of the ideological spectrum, if you like, of degrowth and degrowth movements. And so I wonder how significant you think ideological differences are within that movement, and if they are significant, how or whether you see that they can be overcome such that the overlaps can be really capitalized on.
Okay, I'll briefly answer first, Ruth. So the genesis of Commonweal was literally, and I was almost in the room when it happened, a newspaper editor sympathetic to independence saying, please can we have some positive policy news stories from your end of the spectrum? So give us something, give us a concept, give us a horizon that isn't just this grind of yes and no and better together and better apart. What that did through being launched in a national newspaper, it became people set up using Facebook, obviously, as people tend to do, just because it's there, started to set up Commonweal groups. And then I think Commonweal then reacted to the fact that people wanted to. But I think one of the reasons why people were setting up these groups was that they actually genuinely wanted a post-partisan space within which to discuss the horizons of sovereignty and the possible institutions and policies of Scottish nation-state independence in a way that could allow them to step out of their party political carapaces, as it were. What has been the interesting failures of Commonweal has been the kind of geographical network still exists and is strong. What's really been a failure for them, and they would admit this, is when they try to set up, how would I put it, constitutive institutions that reflect the Commonweal. For say a craft digital gift shop, for example, or a social network that's as flexible as Facebook. Or something else, or that's not been successful. What becomes successful is when they use their mimetic power, their relationship with the media, to send forward memes that change legislatures, classically something called Our Land. So this was about land reform and about keeping the pressure on the Scottish government, both from the ecological angle, also from the historical angle in terms of the clearances, to ensure rights to buy, rights to control were as strong and as progressive as they could be. And Commonweal, used their symbolic media power that they have and contacts that they had amassed. They're very good at thunderclapping a campaign, but the Commonweal is definitely hegemonic. They're definitely Gramscian much more than an anarchist. But I think the longer that the top-down political sclerosis goes on, and if climate crisis gets any more pervasive, I think there's a lot of people will be saying, what are we going to do in Perth? What are we going to do in Inverness? What are we going to do in Comrie or whatever? So I think there's an anarchist moment definitely coming in Scotland. It's definitely coming.
So thanks a lot for the question, Ruth. So I would say that in degrowth, there is a multiplicity of voices and something that has been articulated as and cherished. So there is definitely a broad agreement on this sustainability and justice at the heart of degrowth, and there is the agreement, I would say, that we are on the radical left and anti-capitalist also. Capitalism as a system connects to growth directly, so in that sense, degrowth cannot be capitalist. But also there is this awareness that, okay, if we have a better system in place based on equality and justice, say socialism, if it is connected to the pursuit of growth as this key idea, it will also come with contradictions. So there are this kind of focal points around which people connected to degrowth unite. But then I would also say that there are different walks of life through which people reach degrowth, because some could be working with more environmental side of things, some with more, say, with social theory. And I think it is quite beautiful how within the academic discussion and the movement this comes together. So and theoretically, when it comes to social theory, I would say that also we say there are certainly anarchist sympathies, there are Marxist sympathies, but also more recently, the decolonial and feminist voices have become more kind of prominent and explicitly addressed in degrowth, which I think the Degrowth Talk series very much reflects, because the very first webinars organized were around degrowth and positioning it as part of the pluriverse that should be feminist and decolonial. So, and I think this is also in a way reflecting on the very closures of degrowth as a movement itself. So I think it was within this internal critique that, okay, we are referring too much to particular scholars, kind of white men, or for example, we are actually referring to the notion of care maybe in quite a simplistic way. So let's bring in the rich discussion that exists in feminist theory to nuance this. So there has been this process which I find very fruitful and which has created this multiplicity and the space where different voices fit and are complementary. But then, of course, so yeah, and I wouldn't say like that I see very grand ideological contradictions at the moment. But what we are discussing now, and this is what the Vienna conference was devoted to, which happened recently, so earlier this month, are the questions of strategy. Because then the question is how we as a movement contribute to the bigger change. And if we need to think and how we think of strategy for transformation. And when thinking about this, certain kinds of closures can come in, and hence it is important to reflect on the possibilities of these closures and to kind of remain open and self-critical in the way that you have described for anarchist groups. In the book that I have co-edited together with Stefania Bark and Alexander Paulsen, we actually try to articulate the idea of nomadic utopianism as this political subjectivity of degrowth, drawing on the notion that was coined by David Bell, based in the UK. So then the idea is that, okay, we should act with courage and we should think about strategy, but also we should be aware of the closures that can be coming with this and cherish this multiplicity of degrowth. So yeah, that's my answer.
Thank you, Katja. Now, it seems like we can go on asking questions from each other until the end of this talk, but there are also many very interesting questions coming in from our audience. So if you're okay, I will now start asking these questions from you. First, I have a question to Katja, which maybe connects to what you were just saying earlier. One of the viewers argues that the paper Degrowth and the State that you mentioned lacks grounding on the Gramscian perspective in the historical materialism roots of neo-Gramscianism. Where are the degrowth researchers on this and transnational historical materialism? As further researched by, for example, Adam David Morton, Andreas Bieler, and Stephen Gill.
Thank you. So the work I was introducing is by Giacomo D'Alisa, so it is his take on this topic. And I would say that, yeah, probably, I'm sure that for those closely engaging with Gramsci and historical materialism discussions, there would be many maybe theoretical weaknesses to kind of to raise and to address. So for me personally, I find it quite interesting, this using the split between civil society and political society, and then using the example of transformation by referring to civil society as an interesting way that Giacomo goes round the very problem of the state and state apparatus. So that would be my kind of, let's say, theoretical critique of the argument there. But still, it's the discussion on the state is emerging and recent, so I think it's a very helpful contribution to it and kind of a starting point. And I think this is how also Giacomo positions his work, which is to be further, developed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Good. Then I have another, actually a two-part question, and this is for Ruth. First part of the question is, do state and organized anarchists exist on the same spectrum? Is there a set of mutually exclusive defining characteristics for which is which? And the second part of this question is, would it be accurate to say that anarchist policies need to be sold to stakeholders, while state policies are simply enforced?
So just the first question. So do state and organised anarchists, I missed the end of the question.
Okay. So do state and organised anarchists exist on the same spectrum? Is there a set of mutually exclusive defining characteristics for which is which?
Okay. I'm not sure. I mean,
Okay.
So I think there are different ways of thinking about, I think anarchists actually have different ways of thinking about what's anarchist. Because they have a notion of society as being always potentially self-organizing, and however strong states are, there are always sort of anarchistic practices within them. So to behave as an anarchist doesn't require you to identify as an anarchist. You can do anarchist things without actually sort of signing up to any kind of ideological set of commitments. I mean, so part of what anarchists want to do is to not sort of get people to wave black flags, but to behave differently, to question authority, to be a bit more disobedient, to organize with their neighbors. And so in that sense, I think there is a sort of, I don't think there's such hard and fast distinctions between what's anarchist or what's anarchistic, but I'm not sure about, I mean, I'm not sure what organized anarchism is as such. On the second point, do anarchist policies, I mean, yeah, state policies can be about, well, I think, you know, to a certain extent, I mean, a lot of state policy is also successful because it's negotiated and it's people consent to it. What the anarchist wants to do is to say, yeah, but when you consent, there's a trade-off here. You know, there are other things going on. So the benefits that you get from the state are never without cost. And there are other ways of organising, if you like, the well-being that states say only they can provide. And that alternative, it comes from self-organising and from developing alternatives. And one of the arguments I guess the anarchists have is that, you know, the kind of welfare services that that states provide don't come from the state. They tend to be absorbed by states. You know, that actually people left to their own devices tend to find ways of looking after each other, tend to find ways of supporting each other. And they, you know, the more that you can encourage that kind of practice, the better. So, I mean, one of the famous examples that one of the great anarchists of the 19th century gives always is the Lifeboat Association. It's a voluntary association. It's not been set up by the state. It's run by volunteers. It's independent. And that's a model of mutual aid. Now, you know, if you can provide that kind of service to rescue people at sea, you can provide all kinds of services. So you don't need states to organize things for you. But you absolutely have to persuade people that they can do this, and it's possible to do this, and it's possible to do it in a way that is, you know, to use the language of degrowth, that is convivial and is not going to exhaust you. Because, you know, there is a kind of I suppose there is a sort of reasonable suspicion that it's more convenient to get somebody else to provide a service for you than to do it yourself. And that's something that I think anarchists have to address. But, you know, for me, that really does neatly sort of dovetail with degrowth, because there's a sort of a natural simplification that's involved in degrowth, a stripping out of stuff that's unnecessary, that we simply don't need, that occupies our time. And they're the kinds of cost savings, if you like, you know, to use the sort of economists' language, that we need to focus on. You know, strip things down, make things simpler, make it so that we can organize these things without relying on the systems of domination that we currently have.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ruth. I have a next question. This is for Pat. How are the Preston or Cumberland groups organized or led or managed? How are policies arrived at and disseminated?
This is a really interesting question, because there are, I mean, I would answer that question by comparing it to something which is a bit more coercive, I find, as an example of municipal advance. And it's something called the Wigan Deal. So it's not the Preston model, but the Wigan Deal, Wigan, another northern industrial town. And the Wigan Deal is basically a kind of behavior change program agreed between, costly, badly self-feeding, ill-exercised, overstressed Wiganites and a local council that is facing ever more stringent cuts on the basis of austerity. And so the deal is that, we will pay attention to you as welfare clients if you eat properly and behave and cost less to our social services and our NHS. And it's reinforced by a kind of culture, a sort of happy-go-lucky cartoon imagery that's plastered on every bus and shelter and so forth and so on. So that's almost like, it's almost like a kind of corporate behavior change program at the level of a town. So that's where it goes bad. The Preston model and certainly the Cleveland model comes from a long tradition of community self-determination. Gal Alperovitz of the Democracy Collaborative is one of the great advisor to MLK, is one of the great forces behind the Cleveland model. And the whole idea of community self-determination of assets, physical assets, service assets, coming back to control of the community is where the Cleveland model comes out of. So, activism, great moments of activism don't come out of nowhere, right? They come out of people having sort of tried and tried and tried again, and then sometime, at some moment, the practice hits the times, hits the zeitgeist, and that was transported over to the Cleveland model, was transported over to Preston. The Labour Council is quite heterodox in Preston. It's sort of they're sort of out of sight, out of mind. So they are not under the control either of, or they can get on with experiments, as it were, because they're regarded as a kind of backwater, both by Westminster as a whole and by the Labour Party in the UK in general. And what's happened is a bit like what Louis Brandeis, the American judge, used to say about American states, the laboratories of democracy. Well, there's a kind of laboratories. What Preston model shows is that you can have laboratories of democracy, but they can be at the kind of small city, big town, municipal level. The next frontier for them is the degree to which they might be able to define what has been called the foundational economy that has been sort of revealed by COVID. The economy that just is required for sort of life to be perpetuated, decent life to be perpetuated. To what extent can that actually establish its own currency system, its own measures of value that are non-monetary, which the mutual aid COVID network is a fantastic and flourishing example of, and echoed by software and echoed also by certain other forms of advanced business organization as well. Sociocracy and so forth. So I think that's a very fruitful moment for a kind of municipal futurism. But I think there's no patience left for national government to come in and provide resources where none are expected. I think there's a great impetus on people looking around themselves and saying, what are the concrete assets in this neighbourhood and how do we mobilise them and how do we activate them? And I think that's the next stage for the Preston model. It's been described by the Peer-to-Peer Foundation as cosmo-localism. So the cosmo element of it is that you draw ideas from the planet, and the local bit of it is, well, you don't receive it at the end of a supply chain. You make it on your doorstep, but you're informed digitally by a cloud of ideas coming down from anywhere. So I think there's great futures in these experiments.
Very, very good, Pat. I have a specific question here to Ruth. Do you think that Bookchin's communalism that inspired Federalist Rojava could be the result of a transition from a strong state? and then in brackets, not in war that still holds the monopoly of physical violence?
Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean the problem, of course, of Rojava is that it faces enormous external obstacles and violence against it. But I mean, I have to say, I've not been to Rojava, so I'm sort of, in that sense, I'm semi-detached. But everything I know about it from people who are involved both on the Kurdish side and the anarchist side, yeah, I would say yes. I think it's an inspiring model for all sorts of reasons. Not just the fact that, you know, there is a clear sort of influence, if you like, or coming together of a kind of an anarchist approach with a bottom-up, grassroots, practical, on the ground experiment, but that's, you know, the feminist involvement is really interesting, and yeah, and I think it's really inspiring.
Thank you. Let's take just 2 or 3 more questions and we'll wrap up. So this one is to Katja. Do you think there is a need for global governance? What institutions could be desirable, whether new or reformed, and what strategies could be used to effect this realistically? Maybe following the concept of subsidiary, limit the global level to climate change, oceans, financial and global economic system, militarization.
Yeah, thanks. That's a tough one. So, but probably the institutions that do global governance are very problematic. So we totally acknowledge this in the degrowth discussion. But at the same time, some issues like climate change have to be addressed at this global level. So there have been, for example, critiques of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, within the degrowth discussion, but also with suggestions, okay, how could they be reframed to actually become closer to what we see as the way forward. And then similarly, there have been calls to the institutions like the European Union to do things differently. So to prioritize well-being rather than growth, and to put also ecological sustainability at the center. So, and it's, so I wonder if governance institutions can be again pushed in the grassroots way. So if we can build some sort of mechanisms that can formulate proposals that can be taken by those institutions we are conditioned by. So I'm thinking now of the Green New Deal that are floating out there, and in particular the Green New Deal for Europe, which was coordinated by the M25 movement, and which is the more kind of degrowth connected, let's say, Green New Deal out there that different grassroots groups have actually participated in. So, and there the idea is to kind of mobilize the grassroots to challenge the very institutions that that still make the decisions. And if there is a way to channel, say, the European Union funding from subsidizing fossil industry and supporting grassroots alternatives, that would be a big change on the ground also. But then the question is how to push such proposals, because so far they kind of are left unnoticed. So I think, yes, let's try to push them also, but also be careful about co-optations, but we are also far from being seen in the first place.
Excellent. Thank you, Katja. I have a very brief follow-up question to that previous question. This is for Ruth, and it fits well. It's a question: how does the multiple anarchist cell system work on a global level?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, there are different ways of thinking about anarchist internationalism. I mean, the best developed models in my mind are those which try and reconfigure what the nation is as a group, which is not bounded and decoupled from the state, but which is can be more or less stable depending on where you're located physically in the world, simply because some places are easier to navigate than others, some are more temperate than others, some have got infrastructure that others haven't got. But the idea, I guess, is that, you know, you're always thinking about building from the local to the global, rather than across the state to create a global. So you're when you think about anarchy, you're not just reconfiguring the domestic state or the distribution of power within the domestic state. You're configuring the whole construction of the state within the international system necessarily. So as soon as you think about changing the way in which power is exercised by local groups anarchistically or anarchically, then you're creating these natural units, or these groups that you could call nations if you like, but they're constructed through their organic developments rather than by any kind of invented markers, be that tradition, language, religion, color, whatever, you know, whatever people have used in the past. So you get rid of all those markers. This is simply about where you're located and how you organize with other people to support each other and provide, or to develop well-being. And the idea is that I mean, the principle of constitutionalism works in the same way within a group as it does across groups, so that you federate, so that you can have agreements or benchmarks, but they have to be negotiated, and they have to be open and transparent, just as agreements within groups are. So you're always thinking about building from the bottom up, but in doing that, you're also thinking about, and I guess that touches on the sort of the decolonizing aspect. You're working on the basis that there's no universal knowledge either. So what people know, they know about their locality typically, and what they can know internationally or globally comes from exchange, and comes from respecting the fact that people are going to approach their worlds with different perspectives and with different kinds of priorities, and we can only learn from each other through that kind of dialogue and exchange. So I think you can imagine global communities. We have, you know, I mean, this is, you know, social justice movement, if you like, initiated international organizations, and they did so on the basis of autonomy and decentralized federation. So that's the kind of model, but it involves a massive change of political culture.
Thank you, Ruth. We'll take two more questions and then we'll wrap up. This is for Pat. From the perspective of someone not involved in the degrowth movement, where do you see the most potential for degrowth to build alliances? Which movements could benefit from connecting with the degrowth thought, and likewise, from which movements can degrowth learn?
Sure. Okay. Now, I think the greatest alliance right now between degrowth and sort of the wider society is with people who are trying to figure out how their communities will survive, maybe thrive, but certainly survive in the kind of radically disrupted age of coronavirus and of a kind of biospheric disruption, which isn't just coming at you from your TV screens or that you hear about from far away, but is on your epidermis and in your throat and down into your lungs. And that has disrupted our sense of, has disrupted our sense of the zone of civic action. I mean, the great irony of Extinction Rebellion occupying public space and then being cleared out of that public space by the epiphenomenon of an agribusiness model. So we are in a thoroughly estranged, we're in an estranged moment about what it is to do publicness and to be active in public and to display the power of that activism. And I think that the radical take of degrowth wishes to say this model is fundamentally wrong, may well click with people who are now experiencing levels of precarity beyond their usual class contentment. And I think that's a big moment for the Green left. And I think that I think it could get down to something quite as specific as a food shortage, a real proper food shortage, you know, or a real energy blackout. You know, the northern towns experiencing worse than ever floods is a kind of the beginning trace of it, but with a COVID that radically restructures the very idea of civicness and publicness itself. I think the idea that if we go back inside to lockdown, that we're actually preparing ourselves, you know, to deal with the problem at root, and so there becomes a real connection between think global, act local, the old Green phrase. It really becomes a tangible connection at the level of why is this farmer unable to feed me locally? Why, if we have all these wind farms, aren't they able to deliver energy to us cheaply, etc., etc., etc. So I think that's a real, strategic opportunity for the Green and eco-conscious politics that sits behind degrowth to connect to the heart of everyday communities. I hope people are alive to that. I hope somebody like XR is alive to that. I don't know that they are yet. But I think it's something, that's a real point of strategic alliance, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Pat. Now the last question goes to Katja. The post-independence Indian state used a justification of constitutional values like liberty and social justice to legitimize itself. The viewer suggests that while in South Asia, one might dream of a power shift away from state towards communities, there is an acute awareness that the community as such is riddled with casteist and sexist norms. How does the degrowth school attack this justification by the state?
Thank you. The end of this phrase, how does degrowth attack?
How does a degrowth school attack this justification by the state? So to be clear, so degrowth is not like there is an open discussion of how we relate to the state, I would say. So we don't justify the oppressive acts that the state does, even if it uses good discourse for it. So the idea is that, yeah, maybe we should push the states to do or we should push the states to do things differently. But of course, states are oppressive and often use the kind of best words for this. But then as the example of the Indian context was brought up, maybe it is a way for me also to say that it is important in the degrowth discussion that degrowth is not the kind of concept that nails it all. So we're very aware that it is a concept that comes from the global North context and speaks to other spaces, but mostly connects to the global North. But the idea is to build alliances with others, and under the umbrella of pluriverse, it is often discussed, and there are many discussions of alternatives in various contexts, including India, which actually also come together with this sustainable and just alternatives and would challenge the inequalities, caste differences, and so on. So in the Indian context, the
concept that is often discussed is ecological Swaraj, and Ashish Kotaris, who was also part of this degrowth talks, is someone who very much puts it forward. So yeah, there are alternatives elsewhere also, including to challenge these hierarchies and oppressions which are created from different agents, including the states.
Mm-hmm. Good. I'm sure we could continue the discussion forever, but it's our time. Time is up for tonight. So I'd like to wrap up the conversation here in the channel, but before we close off, to give our speakers a chance for a quick closing remark. So I'd like you to address this question in your closing remark. With a view to a brighter future, what's the most exciting development you see in the world these days? What gives you hope, and what's your hope for the next months? Ruth, can I ask you to start?
Yeah, so yeah, there's a lot to be miserable about, but actually, I mean, I'd like to, I suppose I'd like to endorse a lot of what Pat said about the kind of the situation that we're in, which is very frightening in many ways. But the thing that I take from it is actually the potential to really push on not returning to normal. And I think there is at least now a public discussion about what that normality is and how attractive normality was, now that people see that environments have changed because people haven't been driving. You know, there's all kinds of questions now also about schooling and how we might sort of think about education differently from assessment. I mean, there's all kinds of positive things, but the most positive for me was seeing the mushrooming of the COVID-19 mutual aid groups. And that, I think, that's a basis for really thinking about how we can push some of those connections, because the health emergency is not going away. Even if we get the health part of it under wraps, we're now facing a real whirlwind in terms of the longer term effects of lockdown and the disruption that's going to be with us for a long time. And I think that is an opportunity. It's a real opportunity to start capitalizing on the kinds of actions that people have been engaging in.
Okay.
Yes, I mean, just to pick up from Ruth, and it's maybe just because I'm being a bit of a tech head, but there was a story that we covered in the Alternative UK. And I mean, we run a blog called The Daily Alternative, which just is dedicated to trying to map so many sort of localist, autonomous activities, practical activities. But it was the school in Scotland which realized that they had a 3D printer, and they downloaded, and their head maths teacher called up his pal in the hospital and said, "Do you need protective equipment?" And they downloaded a plan from a pair of Czech postgrads, and that's the tiniest glimmer of what could be arranged. What the kind of I mean, so much implied there. You know, objects that can be repaired rather than just be thrown away. You know, levels of infrastructural complexity in localities that localities decide to use in a particular way. There's so much there. It was just this tiny glimmer of the next something that might come into being within the next 50 years that was about it was a kind of about care and usefulness, but also ingenuity and horizontal connection. So more of that, please.
So I agree also completely that the current crisis brings a momentum for change. So, but of course there are all the problematic forces working towards going back to normal, and we should really resist this and call for alternative future. So, and for this, I would say that what makes me positive is that I see a lot of organizing out there. So as a degrowth movement, I would say that we have managed to respond to the current crisis relatively fast with positions from FADA, for example, or the Degrowth Open Letter, and so on. So to kind of articulate our collective position on this, which is a starting point for further organizing and work. But also there are many maybe scattered movements out there. And I think that there is a real potential that we should come together, so that the kinds of collective voices of the different movements are the ones that are heard and are the ones that push change in different ways. So with or against the states, partially with the states, or in whichever ways, and drawing on the multiple helpful theories that can help us to make sense of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And now it's time to end the recording of this talk, but I hope this is not the end of the conversation. I hope all of you watching tonight have learned something new, as I have, and are excited to share these new insights with your friends, family, and colleagues. A big thank you for our fantastic speakers. Thank you for your thoughts and for making the time to contribute to the series. Thank you, Oksana, for sorting out the audience questions. And I guess we both can agree that we had an exceptional conversation tonight. And thank you for the all-important off-screen team. Before we end tonight, I'm incredibly happy to announce that we will meet again tomorrow with our first No Back to Normal Degrowth talk in Spanish. We have thought about this possibility already for some time. Many of us organizing the talks feel that the need to hold this space together, not only in the English language, but in many different languages. So we'd love to reach out to involve many more fantastic speakers, be it researchers, activists, practitioners, or artists from all over the world, to discover together the multidimensional concept of degrowth that escapes single definitions. So tomorrow is the beginning of this experiment. Please join us for the Decrecer para Vivir Bien. And just to confirm that the talk tomorrow will start at the same time as the talk tonight. So wherever you are, come along at the same time as tonight. After tomorrow's talk, we still have 3 more talks lined up for June. We'll cover biodiversity, urbanization, and arts. Check the YouTube channel or the summer school website or Twitter feed for details, which will be there latest early next week. Thank you again, and good night, everyone. It's been a pleasure to be here with you tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Done.